This week, we have reached the middle of the book of Leviticus. Leviticus comes after Genesis and Exodus, but before Numbers and Deuteronomy, which means that we have this week reached the middle of the middle. In other words, we are in the heart of the Torah. And what do we find here in the heart? Parshat Kedoshim, specifically a section of laws called the Holiness Code, 51 separate commandments. There are those that you've likely heard of. Do not steal, don't worship idols. And there are also those that aren't quite as well known. Do not eat a tree's fruit for the first 3 years of its life. Don't work as a psychic. But I want to focus on one commandment in particular. Do not curse the deaf. Do not mock them. On its face, this commandment seems pretty straightforward, and the ethics behind it seem equally self-evident, but I promise I've got a whole sermon about it. Hang tight. What is going on here? Mockery of anyone is unkind, all the more so when it's based on a physical attribute outside of the person's control. At first, this commandment seems similar to the prohibitions about mistreating the widow or the orphan or the poor. A deaf person, especially one who lived in biblical times that predated both sign language and widespread literacy, would have been particularly vulnerable. They were unable to communicate with others. But it's a little more complicated than that. The verse could have stated, "You should not curse anyone." That sort of universal prohibition would have covered all types of people. But of course, that's not what the verse says. It's limited to cursing or mocking those who cannot hear. And while being deaf was a disadvantage in biblical society, it was far from the only challenging attribute a person might have. So why a prohibition that specifically singles out the deaf? Now, that is not the entire verse. That's only the first half. The second half teaches another lesson that you have probably heard of before, that you are not to place a stumbling block before the blind. And these two verses seem to fit together quite nicely in a parallel here. Don't say mean things to the deaf, do not trip the blind. They seem similar, but the difference is striking. Tripping a blind person results in a blind person falling. It results in a moment of terror and a loss of control. It results in potential injury. It also results in embarrassment and a lack of trust, both in one's own ability to navigate the world and in the other people who inhabit it. Just imagine what it would be like not only to fall, but to realize it was because someone did it intentionally. Imagine having to get up and for the rest of the day and for the rest of your life, wonder when it's going to happen again. Tripping a blind person is not some sort of mean-spirited prank. It is an act of violence. Why would anyone do this? We like to think people do the right thing because it's the right thing, but as history has proven, that is not always the case. Sometimes we do the right thing because we realize there are consequences if we don't. Tripping a sighted person has consequences. They are likely to retaliate. But a blind person is at a distinct disadvantage in this scenario. How is a blind person going to retaliate? How is a blind person going to be able to stand up for him or herself? Taking advantage of this person allows for consequence-free cruelty. Again, why would anyone do this? Last week, we commemorated Yom HaShoah, and we were reminded that if society condones cruelty, if the government says, tonight, you are now allowed to loot businesses, burn down houses of worship, and there will be no punishment, we know there are far too many who will jump at that opportunity. We are forbidden from tripping a blind person because we are forbidden from hurting other people. not because we'll be punished, but because it's wrong. A moral society is one that differentiates between might and right. But back to the deaf person. These commandments, like I said, might seem similar, but they could not be more different. The previous example is wrong because someone is hurt and there is a victim. But who exactly is the victim in this example? A deaf person can't hear you. Her feelings will not be hurt. Her life will be no different whether you say something insulting to her or not. Yeah, true, I'm not in favor of mocking those who cannot hear, and I think most of us would agree that doing so would be reprehensible. But what I'm getting at here is why? What is wrong with that act? And maybe a different example will be helpful. If I am traveling the world and I buy a cup of coffee in a foreign country, and as I pay for my transaction, the barista smiles at me and cheerfully says, "I hope you spill this all over your lap." As long as they're smiling and as long as it's said in a language I don't understand, who's the victim here? It's not me. I'm going to smile, say thank you, and remark about how warm and friendly the people are wherever I am compared to how mean they are where I came from. Insulting people who can't understand you doesn't hurt them. So then why is it wrong? Because it's not about the person being insulted. It's about the person who is doing the act of insulting. I'd like to quote from an essay that was posted to slate.com exactly 2 years ago. I'm going to read it verbatim, which means I have to acknowledge that the person described in this paragraph here happens to share my name. It's always disappointing when a Jeremy falls far from grace. But here we go. When Jeremy barked orders at his personal assistant, she didn't flinch, but I did. Something about the sound of his sharp, commanding tone, directed not at me, but still at a woman, repulsed me. In a few weeks that we had been dating, he had never spoken to me this way. But could he? Hearing Jeremy make ungrateful demands didn't make him seem powerful or important. He sounded entitled and difficult, like someone who enjoyed commanding for the sake of commanding. He would ask her to do things he could easily do himself, almost as if to prove that he could. Okay, here's the plot twist. Jeremy is not talking to an employee or an assistant. No, he is talking to Alexa, the disembodied voice of Amazon's virtual assistant. If you've ever used Siri or Alexa or called customer service and spoken with a robot, you've undoubtedly become frustrated with these interactions. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Perhaps you've spoken in a way that you wouldn't speak to a real person, and perhaps you've told yourself it's fine. It's just a computer program. We often think of ethics as they relate to interpersonal relationships. What does it mean to be a good person? Most people will inevitably answer that it's about how you treat other people. And I'm not going to downplay that. That is significant. After all, Hillel famously said the essence of Torah is, what is hateful to you, do not do to another. But that's not all there is to ethics. I mentioned this week that our Torah portion is Kiddushim. Torah portions get their name from the first significant word in the portion. Kiddushim means holy, and the verse in full says, "You, Israel, shall be holy, for I, Adonai, am holy." God is holy. God is the type who, when talking to Siri, says please and thank you. To quote Maimonides, the Torah is not just concerned with the cursed, but also with the curser. The person who should not give in to anger and vindictiveness, screaming at a virtual assistant or the referee or the politician that's on TV is bad, not because anyone is going to be hurt, but because it's bad for you It's bad for your holiness to behave in such a way. Rabbeinu Bachya adds that we are reminded to control our language and ultimately the removal of bad habits, the elevation of holiness. The person who appears to be a mensch but is always holding his tongue from saying what he really thinks, well, he still has holiness left to attain. As we pass this midway point in our Torah, let us be reminded of our obligations not just to other people, but to our God and to ourselves. Now more than ever, we need holiness in our world, and it needs to start with us.